Today, we're going to dive into everything about Dr. Dre. Hope you enjoy. They say that if you listen closely enough to the streets of South Central Los Angeles, the asphalt has its own soundtrack. It is a symphony of survival, written in the key of poverty, friction, and raw, unfiltered anger. But in the mid-1960s, in the volatile, sun-drenched neighborhoods of Compton, nobody was writing symposia for the kids on the block. There was only a boy named Andre Romel Young, born to teenage parents, moving from one cramped apartment to another, sleeping through the echoes of the 1965 Watts riots. He didn't grow up in a world of privilege. He grew up in a crucible of concrete, looking at the world not as a playground, but as a chaotic wall of noise that desperately needed structure. While other kids were running the streets, running from the gangs or running with them, Andre was locked in his room, drowning in his mother's record collection. He wasn't looking at the album covers for the faces. He was looking for the invisible threads that connected the bass lines of Parliament Funkadelic to the human soul. At school, he was a ghost. His mind wasn't on the blackboard. It was inside the mechanics of a mixer. They called him a dreamer, an outcast, a kid who wouldn't amount to much because he spent his nights spinning records at a local club called Eve After Dark under the alias Dr. J. But what the world failed to see was the terrifying clarity with which he understood sound. He didn't just want to play music. He wanted to domesticate the noise of the streets. And then the universe aligned. Enter Eric Wright, a street-smart hustler known as Eazy-E, and O'Shea Jackson, a teenage poet known as Ice Cube. Eazy-E had the raw, dangerous capital from the streets. Ice Cube had the venomous lyrics. But Andre, now calling himself Dr. Dre, had the weapon. He looked at the primitive, commercialized hip-hop of New York and saw an empire waiting to be built in the West. In 1987, inside a claustrophobic makeshift studio, they didn't just record an album. They launched an act of pure, unadulterated rebellion. Straight Outta Compton wasn't business. It was a sonic pipe bomb dropped directly into the heart of white America. Dre took the terrifying reality of police brutality and gang warfare and wrapped it in a heavy, hypnotic bass line that forced the entire world to look at Compton. But kings who build their empires on chaos are bound to bleed from the inside. Success didn't just knock on Dr. Dre's door. It tore the house down and left him standing in the debris. By 1990, N.W.A. was the most dangerous group in the world, turning a raw, independent label into a multi-million-dollar gold mine. But behind the curtain of gold plaques, the foundation was fracturing. Money has a strange way of revealing the monsters in your circle. Dre looked at his contract, looked at the manager, Jerry Heller, and realized he was being treated like a disposable asset while others grew rich off his genius. In a closed-door boardroom coup, the brotherhood shattered. Dre walked away from N.W.A., leaving his childhood friends behind, publicly humiliated and deeply bitter. But a predator who has been locked out of his first cage will build a fortress that no one can tear down. Enter Marion Suge Knight, a towering, terrifying former football player who operated not with contracts, but with raw, physical intimidation. Together, they founded D.R.E. Records. Imagine the year 1992. Los Angeles is burning during the Rodney King riots, and inside the studio, Dr. Dre is redefining the laws of music. He invented G-Funk, a slow, slinky, weed smoke-filled reinterpretation of 70s funk that turned the violence of the West Coast into a cinematic masterpiece. The Chronic dropped like a sonic boom. It turned a garage-level subgenre into the dominant cultural force on the planet. Suddenly, Dre was the undisputed king of the tech and music world, a rock star who didn't even need to raise his voice to control a room. He discovered a lanky, charismatic kid named Snoop Doggy Dogg, turning him into a global icon just by humming a melody behind his vocals. But the throne of D.R.E. was built on a graveyard. As the mid-90s arrived, the label became infected by a terrifying, borderline pathological environment of violence. Guns in the studio. Men being beaten in hallways. The arrival of Tupac Shakur turned the label into a militarized faction in an all-out coastal war. Dre looked around the kingdom he had co-created and realized his art was being swallowed by real-world blood. In 1996, at the absolute peak of Death Row's commercial dominance, Dre did the unthinkable. He walked out, leaving his royalties, his masters, and his safety behind, stepping entirely alone into the wilderness. What does a conqueror do when he leaves his sword in the burning ruins of his old kingdom? Most men would have retired to a mansion, counted their millions, and faded into the background of history. But Dr. Dre wasn't built for comfort. He was fueled by a dark, burning desire for absolute vindication. This period, the late 90s, is what historians call the wilderness years. He founded Aftermath Entertainment, a label dedicated to proving he didn't need Suge Knight, N.W.A, or Death Row to be a god. It was a commercial disaster. The early Aftermath compilations stalled. The tech industry and the music critics laughed at him. They said he was washed up, a 90s relic whose ego had finally devoured his talent, a one-hit wonder who couldn't survive without the dangerous energy of the streets. To make matters worse, the shadows of his past kept bleeding into his reality. Tupac was dead. Biggie was dead. The industry was haunted by ghosts. Dre sat in his studio in the hills, staring at a blank mixing board, losing millions of his own wealth every single month, suffocating under the pressure of his own myth. And then the universe aligned for a third time. Jimmy Iovine, a brilliant, cynical record executive, handed Dre a cassette tape of a pale, angry kid from Detroit. Enter Marshall Mathers, Eminem. The entire industry told Dre he was insane. You cannot sign a white rapper. It will destroy your remaining credibility. But Dre didn't see color. He saw the exact same raw, unadulterated friction that he had inside his own soul. He took Eminem into the studio, locked the doors, and together they built a psychological vortex that smashed the entire cultural landscape. In 1999, Dre answered his critics with 2001, an album that didn't just save his career, it broke the music industry's back and rebuilt it around his production style. He followed it by discovering a street-hardened storyteller from Queens named 50 Cent. Dre had learned patience. He had learned how to let other geniuses breathe and create under his meticulous, perfectionist guidance. The master had returned to his forge, and this time the empire wasn't built on blood. It was built on pure, unchallengeable art. By the mid-2000s, Dr. Dre had achieved total dominance over the sonic world. But the ultimate tragedy of a perfectionist is that the world around you moves too slow. The internet arrived, Napster arrived, and the music industry began to bleed out. Audio files were compressed into low-quality MP3s. People were listening to his meticulously engineered bass lines through cheap, plastic white earbuds. To a man who spent 3 weeks adjusting the sound of a single snare drum. This wasn't just a change in business. It was an insult to his religion. One afternoon, while walking on a beach with Jimmy Iovine, Dre complained that a sneaker company wanted him to endorse shoes. Iovine looked at him and said, "F shoes. Sell speakers." That was the spark. In 2008, they launched Beats by Dr. Dre. It wasn't just hardware. It was a cultural colonization. Dre took the heavy, bass-rich profile of the Compton streets and put it into a sleek, translucent headphone that screamed to be touched. He made headphones a status symbol, a piece of high art that every athlete, rock star, and teenager on Earth had to wear around their neck. For 7 years, Dre abandoned his long-promised album Detox, using his legendary reality distortion field to focus entirely on the empire of hardware. The hip-hop purists screamed that he had sold out, that he was a corporate suit who had forgotten his roots. He ignored them. And then, May 2014, Apple Inc. steps onto the stage. In a historic $3 billion acquisition, Apple bought Beats Electronics. The boy who grew up dodging police helicopters in Compton had just become the first official billionaire in hip-hop history. He didn't just cross the tracks. He bought the railroad. The ultimate paradox of Andre Young is that the moment he achieved absolute financial dominance over the capitalist world, His own mortality came to collect the debt. In January 2021, at the age of 55, he was rushed to the ICU with a brain aneurysm. As he lay in a hospital bed in Los Angeles, surrounded by doctors who weren't sure if he would survive the night, the world watched in silence. The vibrant sound architect was suddenly frail, fighting a war inside his own veins. But biology doesn't care about billions, and perfectionism doesn't cure a bleeding brain. He survived, and his response to death was the same response he had to Suge Knight and the critics. He returned to the forge. In 2022, he stood on the stage of the Super Bowl LVI halftime show, right in the center of Los Angeles, flanked by Snoop Dogg, Eminem, Mary J. Blige, and Kendrick Lamar, the entire lineage of his musical children. He sat at a white grand piano, played the iconic keys of Still D.R.E., and forced the NFL, corporate America, and the global audience to celebrate the sounds born in the concrete blocks of Compton. It was his ultimate coronation, a giant circle completing a story that started 40 years prior in a dusty family garage. Was he a good man? Ask the women he wronged in his youth, the engineers he broke with his pathological demands for perfection, or the friends he left behind in the ruins of old labels, and they will tell you he could be a tyrant. He was flawed, cold, and deeply broken in ways that a $3 billion check could never heal. But if you measure a life by the dent it leaves on the universe, Dr. Dre stands entirely alone. He didn't just produce records, he engineered the modern cultural landscape. He showed us that genius isn't about being nice, it's about an unyielding, fanatical refusal to accept the world's noise as it is. The boy from Eve After Dark is gone, but the empire he imagined is the world we are all listening to right now. That's all from Mango. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.